So today is the first day of this June 2022 7-day session here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. We've had a tremendous amount of rain. It's still raining. This is several days worth of rain and nonstop, actually, pretty much. And it's flooding. It's causing a lot of flooding. At the same time, there are other parts of the United States and the world that are extremely dry. There's expected an extreme heat wave, triple-digit temperatures in the south coming up. Global warming is certainly upon us. One might even consider the possibility that this is an entry into what is known as the Kali Yuga, the Dharma ending age, where everything ultimately disappears. It's hard to know. There's some extremely good things coming out of the extreme bad that's been happening, and that's worth noting. In Zen practice, I'm going to diverge a bit. You saw at the very beginning that we do prostrations. Prostrations are traditional in Asia, all over Asia actually, and caused a great deal of perplexity and dismay to the British colonists who colonized a great deal of Asia. And there is a true story, by John Blofeld, who was an eminent Buddhist practitioner and writer. And he has some wonderful books. He is dead now. He died, I think it was in the 80s. And he had, as a child, been given a Buddha figure by an aunt. It was quite common. He's British. He was British. It was quite common for the British to go to Asia to explore and to even to live. And there were some great anthropologists who went, and also some great early Buddhist translators. And so he ended up with this Buddha figure as a child, and somehow he connected with it. And he yearned to go to China, and ultimately he did go to China. He felt a tremendous affinity with that country, and actually ended up beginning to study, to practice with a Chinese Buddhist teacher. And at one point, he asked the teacher when he would see him again, or if he would see him again. He was going away for some reason. And the teacher hesitated and then said no. And you have to know that it's still traditional in China today and in Chinese culture today among Buddhists to do a prostration, 3 prostrations actually, at the feet of your teacher. Whether you're encountering them on a sidewalk or out in a field or in a temple, it doesn't matter where. When you encounter that teacher, you honor that teacher by prostrating before that person. And the prostration is an expression of honor. It's an expression that Roshi Keplo called lowering the mast of ego. As it turns out, he was walking with another British man in a market at some point in some city, and he saw his teacher coming towards him. But the teacher did not acknowledge him, walked right past him. And I'm sure that was because the teacher understood that it would put Blofeld in a very, very difficult predicament, because there he was with another Britisher. And if he stopped to do prostrations before a Chinese man, it would become highly noticed, and the information would be spread far and wide. And as a civil servant, he would probably have had some difficulty maintaining his job. That's how it was back then. And even earlier in the United States, in Zen practice, people resisted doing prostrations. Here at Mountain Gate, we follow the Rinzai system, where rather than prostrating to a Buddha at the front of the altar, we prostrate across the aisle to each other, honoring the true nature, the Buddha nature, the innate perfection of each one of us. Nothing outside of us, no Buddha figure up there on the altar to inspire or otherwise motivate us. But we ourselves, person to person, bowing before, honoring the Buddha nature of each one of us. This is important, particularly in this world today. So we have gathered today and for this week to do Zazen. And why? Why would we want to sit here long hours, maybe with our knees aching, our backs aching, getting tired, getting bored, getting irritated, and all the other mind states that flow through us when we're not distracting ourselves. But I'm sure there is also a measure of distracting ourselves as well, because that is what we are habituated to. But we're here because we have a sense that there's something more, something incredibly valuable, something freeing perhaps, something that we need to return to. And that is absolutely right on. Some people come to Zen practice through suffering. In fact, there was the man who went to visit Roshi Kapleau in the 1960s, 20 years after he had been in the invasion of Normandy and survived it, but returned to the United States, wandering aimlessly around New York City, lost in this enormous, over-encompassing question: why is there suffering in the world? Why is there suffering in the world? He had seen such suffering in that invasion. It was a brutal one. War is brutal. And it just grabbed him around the neck. And he couldn't work. He couldn't do anything but wander the streets, bumping into traffic poles because he was so lost in this question. And after about 6 months, he had an epiphany. And it brought him a great amount of joy. But he had no connection with anything or anyone that could have made a difference for him and helped him deepen that opening, that initial opening, and bring it to life in his life. And so when he went to visit Roshi Kapleau at somebody's urging, he came because it seemed like he might have had some level of kensho, some level of awakening to the truth. And Roshi verified that, but he also said that for him it was a distant memory at that point. And Roshi said that if he did Zazen, he would probably be able to bring it back. But he never saw the man again. We don't want to do the work. We have to be pushed against a wall often in order to be willing to do the work it takes to truly become free. And truly become free is what we can do. There is no doubt in my mind about this. It is impossible to describe this freedom. It is a freedom beyond anything anyone can imagine. And this is why, for example, coming face to face with God has no words. And I think that the Muslim community that refuses to picture, to develop any kind of picture of Allah or God is absolutely right on, because it cannot be pictured, it cannot be even described in words, but it can be known. And it can be known through our Zazen. We have these marvelous tools, in particular, the Susokan, the extended out breath, coupled with, and it is necessarily coupled with, if it's to have its appropriate effect, this sense of possibility that there is something that through this extended out breath we can open to, that is what we are seeking. And we can. The challenge is the Zen practice is a long and challenging path. It is said that Chogyam Trungpa, who was a Tibetan teacher of infamous fame, but still, he used to give many talks, public talks. And at one point, he arrived at a public talk and announced to the audience, "Leave now, because if you don't, you're going to have a long haul, and you might not want to do that." There are people that come to Zen practice and after some period of time, months, a year, 2 years, even 5 years, well, not usually 5 years, but 3 or 4 years, disappear. They've had a taste, they've bumped into what they're going to meet, at least some of what they're going to meet through this process, and they decide that's not for them. But if we are dedicated, if we're willing to slog through the swamp, climb the mountain, do what is necessary to open to where we are caught in our practice, in our life, in our living. Because all of us are subject to conditioning. All of us are subject to attachments. Some of us pretty serious attachments. And we need to open to the full catastrophe of those experiences. But there is a way that is extremely effective. And once we get a handle on that way, we find we can really move seamlessly through pretty much anything. It was interesting. I remember many times witnessing my father getting some level of bad news. And he would just simply be silent and quiet, introspective for a little while, and then he would be back to himself again. And the last time I witnessed this, I had taken him to the eye doctor, and he thought he needed new glasses. So the doctor said to me that my father couldn't even see the big E. And he told my father, "I'm not telling you you should go right out and get a seeing eye dog yet, but ... And my father absorbed it. We took him home. He was quiet for maybe 2 or 3 hours, and then he was back to normal. He had somehow, whether he was born with it, I don't know. I never talked to him about it, but he had an understanding of how to become one with, in the parlance of Zen, whatever it was that was going on for him. And through that becoming one with not denying, not tuning out, not dissociating, not avoiding whatever difficult news or whatever difficult situation arose, but walking right into it, absorbing it, feeling it in his body. And he was able to become free of it. He wasn't a Zen student. In fact, at one point, when I was visiting him after my mother had died and he was living in a senior citizens center in North Carolina. Yeah. One Sunday morning, he said, "Well, shall we go to church?" And I said, "Do you want to go to church?" And he said, "Do you want to go to church?" And I said, "Well, I'll go if you want to go." And he said, "I was going to go if you wanted to go. So let's not go." So we didn't go. He didn't need to. At one point, Roshi Kapleau used to quote whoever it was that said that human beings have the infinite in the palm of their hand, and they sit down playing with a toy called God. Of course, church takes place because people are trying to search for that and trying to search in the only way they know. And so we have churches and mosques and synagogues and other environmental holy places, including zendos. Here, there's a long, millennia-old tradition of coming to awakening and handing that down to future generations. In Rinzai, it is still required that to be a teacher, you have had to have Kensho. You have had to have long training. In my case, the 40-some years. And it's important because it's very easy to lead people astray if you haven't gone to at least a certain depth. And I certainly do not say that I have gone all the way. As far as I'm concerned, there's much farther to go, much more to open to, much more to be free from. Almost every day, I become aware of a place I'm still caught that I hadn't even realized. But I know now how to work with that. And you also can do the same and reach perhaps even deeper realization than I ever have. It is your potential to be completely free. Innately, you are perfect, whole and complete, lacking nothing. It is only because we have developed conditioning, and conditioning is essential, so we shouldn't knock it. But there's a certain amount of conditioning, a certain type of conditioning that really skews our ability to live a happy and fulfilling life. And so we sit down on our seat in the zendo, or in a forest, or at home, or wherever, and we turn our attention inward, and we search. We open. We don't even know what we are opening to or what we were searching for. It has no name, so we can't call it anything. But there is a strong, deep sense within us that there is something, and that it is important to return to. And that is absolutely right on. And with that as motivation, you can do it. However, as you begin to work in that direction, you're going to find yourself, as I said, bored, frustrated, irritated, um, joyful, blissful, which is not exactly helpful, by the way, although it's tempting for people. Um, and you just keep trekking on, just keep nose to the ground, sniffing out that truth. And gradually, the attachments begin to thin out. They begin to wear away to the point where you can have an insight. And that is not sufficient yet. It's a big step forward. Kalu Rinpoche, a Tibetan master who has died quite a long time ago at this point, but within this lifetime, we used to go and hear his talks in Santa Fe in the 1980s. There's a book of his teachings called A Flash of Lightning in the Dark Night. And this is enlightenment, or I should say Kensho. Kensho literally means in Japanese, seeing into, meaning seeing into the nature of reality. And it's like you're struggling up a mountain path in the dark, a strange, unknown mountain path in the dark, and you're going hand in hand over rocks. You're worried you're going to fall off a cliff that you don't see. You're just struggling to go forward. Sometimes Zazen can be like that. Or as Roshi Kapleau once commented to me, at one point in his early practice, it felt like he was trying to swim through wet cement. We just had a sidewalk poured recently here, so maybe some of you can get a sense of that. At any rate, you're struggling up this mountain path, and suddenly there's a flash of lightning, and it lights up briefly for an instant the path ahead of you. And now you know where you are going to be going, where you have to go. It's not broad daylight, which you can see all around, but it is an inspiring, motivating moment where you can get some level of insight. Oh, I am on the right path. Oh, it is working. And then you have to keep on going. There's a metaphor. A group of people set out to climb a mountain, and they're joyfully going up this path, and then they reach a lookout at a certain point, and they look out and see this vast expanse, and oh my God, this is incredible. And a portion of the group is satisfied. That's high enough for me. But then the rest of the group continues on, and then there's a higher place with an even better view. And some of them stay there. And then on up, higher and higher, more incredible views. And gradually, the group has dwindled to the point where only a handful of people actually reach the top. I hope that each one of us is part of that group that reaches the top, because it is invaluable for yourself. It is invaluable for society, because the transformation that happens to each one of you is a positive transformation, and it is, well, because of mirror neurons and simply the fact that we are all interconnected, it affects countless other beings in positive ways. And I can give you a couple of examples of this. Some of you have already heard these examples. And when Mitra-roshi was head monk, one of the 4 head monks at Shofukuji, when he was still training under Yamada Mumon-roshi, he led a detail of monks and men who were also at the monastery, some of whom were foreigners. I know 2 of them actually who were in that group. And one of them told me this. There was a a group of homeless people living on the property, and they felt that the temple was cheating them out of water. And the leader of the group, who Daikatsu described to me as clearly someone not a stranger to violence, accosted the Roshi, although he wasn't the Roshi back then. He was Do-san, was how he was called, and was right in his face, extremely loud and belligerent and demanding, red-faced. And Daikatsu actually hung on to a shovel he'd been using in case, he said, he needed to whack the guy if he took a swipe at Do-san. And what happened was that Do-san was not caught by the man's irrationality, by his rage, by his potential violence. He was inwardly calm. He did not respond with anything except looking the man gently in the eye, honoring him, and getting increasingly quiet within. There was no interchange of words from him, only the bellowing of this enraged man. And gradually the man began to quiet down, influenced, I'm sure, by the demeanor of Do-san. And it was settled, the situation was settled quietly, and the man went away. And then there is Jacques Lusseron, the blind man, Frenchman, who was hauled into Buchenwald as it wasn't a spy, he was part of a group of resistance fighters, teenagers like himself, friends of his, who had gathered because they had decided that with the invasion of the Nazis into France, they were witnessing people that they respected and valued disappearing, taken away by the Gestapo. And they also witnessed that the German propaganda was beginning to bring a great deal of fear and anxiety into the French population. And they decided they had to do something about it. And so they did things that would have caused them to be executed. And actually some of them were caught and were executed. And they listened to clandestine radio and printed up, or probably typed up, a little newspaper and peddled it around all over France on their bicycles, figuring that accurately that the Nazis would not pay much attention to a kid on a bike with papers in his basket, perhaps coming home from school. And they had a great deal of influence, actually. And as I understand it, that resistance group, that newspaper, still exists. Not the resistance group so much, but the newspaper that developed out of it is Le Monde. And it still exists in France today. At any rate, Jacques, being blind and extremely perceptive, he was blinded in a school accident when he was 8. He didn't have great eyesight to begin with, and he was wearing glasses. And this was before they had glasses that wouldn't break. And so in the enthusiasm of the kids to race out to recess one day, somebody shoved him from behind and he went smack into the corner of the teacher's desk. And that was the end of his eyesight. But his parents were apparently quite enlightened people. And they convinced the school to allow him to stay with his class, even though he couldn't see. All he had to do was learn Braille over the summer, which he did. And so he stayed in that school all the way through high school. and had many, many friends. He used to go hiking with his friends, actually, up in the mountains. So when they decided to organize, it was just a very, very small group, a handful of kids at that point, and he was chosen to be the person to be the gateway to membership because he was so perceptive. And so whenever some young kid was interested in being part of it, they would be sent to visit him. And if he had a sense that this was not the right person, um, in other words, that they weren't going to be a fit, they were going to perhaps be a danger. As far as the kid knew, he was just visiting a blind kid at home. And that was the end of it. And then there was one young man that came supposedly with a recommendation of someone that Jacques really respected. And against his deepest sense, he went ahead and allowed the man into the group. The way they had it set up, wisely, was such that they were in cells. In other words, there was no one except Jacques who knew who everybody in the resistance group was. Everybody else had a very limited number of acquaintances within the group. Nobody had access to the entire group. And so it was that this man ratted on him. And so that, I think there were 22 kids in that group, including Jacques, were hauled in by the Nazis, first put in French prison and then exported in a brutal 3-day train ride where they were forced to stand the entire 3 days, except for occasionally being let out at a station and forced to run with a cup of hot soup in their hands, chased by police dogs, and shot if they tried to run away. And so it was that he entered Buchenwald. And I'll skip to the part that is particularly important here. And that is that initially, because he was blind and everyone was desperate, they stole his food. And like everyone, he was starving, only perhaps a little bit more starving because he had even less food than other people did. And so after 5 months, the stress of the situation, along with the lack of nourishment, caused him to develop a number of very serious lethal or potentially lethal illnesses. There were 3 doctors in the camp who were also prisoners, and they diagnosed him, so he knew exactly what they were called, and they took him away to die in a space which was a luxury, because the barracks he lived in, it was impossible, he wrote, to move around through the barracks without bumping into another human being. It was that crowded. But instead of dying, he tuned in. He gave a very precise description of exactly what was going on in his body. And he wrote that he took advantage of the situation to leave Buchenwald. What he meant by that was to leave his ideas about what he needed to have, what he could endure, where he was, to let them all go. And he recovered. And in the process of letting go, he found joy. And he also wrote that the joy never left him, even though there was almost a year left before the Allies liberated the camp. And that joy was still obvious. And at work, decades later, when he was a professor teaching in the United States. And it was such that while he was still in Buchenwald, nobody stole his food anymore. There's something about his being, his demeanor, that connected with people in a very positive, easing of stress and fear and anxiety way. And so they would wake him up many times and lead him to people who were freaking out, because he was able to simply, with his presence, calm people down. There are other people you may have met, actually. And in fact, Mitra-roshi had planned never to have anything to do with being a Buddhist priest. His father was one, and he grew up in a Buddhist temple in Nara, Japan. And when he was in high school, his father asked him to take some documents to a temple in part of the Myoshinji complex in Kyoto, because he was going to school in Kyoto. It might have been college, because he went to Hanazono University, I believe, which is a Rinzai Buddhist university in Kyoto. And so he got on an earlier bus than usual. And at a certain point, an older man got on the bus dressed in Buddhist robes, priest robes, which rather amazed him, because this man was inwardly deeply quiet and simply made his way to the back of the bus and sat down and began reading a little book. And he was so impressed by the essence, the sense, the perceived quality of this man, that he was delighted when he discovered that he got off the bus at the same place, and not only got off the bus at the same place, but went to the same temple, which happened to be Mitra-roshi's temple within the Myoshinji complex. Myoshinji is a very, very, very old Buddhist temple. It's a headquarters temple for the Rinzai sect, and it was established in the 600s. So it's quite old, and as monks grew and became teachers themselves, they built temples right next to the main temple. And by the time, at this point, there are 44 temples within that compound. It's a very large compound. And Ryuin was the temple, the sub-temple, that Yamada Momon was the abbot of. He was also the president of Hanazono University, I think, or at least he was at one time. And eventually was also the abbot of Shofukuji in Kobe, Japan. And young Harada was so taken with this man's energy, his deep quiet, that when he graduated from college, instead of going into psychology, which he had planned to do because he said he did not like himself and thought that through psychology he could change for positive direction, instead he walked from Nara to Kobe to become a student of Yamada Mitra-roshi, and was ordained by him and is his successor. He spent 20 years training with him. As another instance of the energy of a person influencing in a positive way others. We've probably all been exposed, I hope actually we haven't, but most of probably have, been exposed to somebody who is very angry. And we know how that feels in our body when we're exposed to an angry person. There's almost like some vibration within our body that is not comfortable. At the same time, being in the presence of somebody who is not angry, who is in a very positive mood, often will inspire us to positive mood as well. So as you go more deeply into your practice and begin to shed attachments, places where you're caught, and become more free to be who you really are, you'll find your life is changing. And one of the reasons why, besides the zazen that we do here, and we also offer the guided metta, or loving kindness meditations every day, and at the beginning of every evening sitting outside of sesshin as well, because there's a lot of work to be done to reach that point. It's called the long maturation. And it means that as we go into our practice, we begin to be more clear and see more clearly our own behavior and see more clearly where we're caught in greed, anger, and delusion. The main delusion, of course, being that we are somebody in particular that has certain qualities, certain fixed qualities, when actually that's a facade. Who we are may make use of that, but who we are is not that. Who we are is eternal, selfless, joyous, pure, as is chanted in the English language version of the Enmeijuku Kanagyo. And we can uncover that because it is innate in everyone, every single one of us. And through these practices that we teach here and support here, this can happen for every single one of you who really puts his mind to it. So we have a whole 7 days. Well, not quite, because we're almost through the first day. 6+ days in which to really give ourselves to this practice. And yes, it may be challenging at times, but I can guarantee you, if you persist, it will be worth it. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.